Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm an economist. I work at Carnegie Mellon University in the United States, and I've been studying privacy for over 15 years now. I try to use economics and behavior economics to understand what are the trade-offs associated with protecting or sharing data, and how consumers make decisions about these trade-offs, and how they value and to what extent they value privacy. So what I tried to do in my intervention was to contrast two different ways of framing the debate over privacy from an economics perspective. On the one hand, you often hear claims being made about the value of consumer data, and these claims tend to emphasize how the value extracted from consumer data creates economic win-win scenarios where everyone is better off. Now, that may be the case, but as I pointed out in my intervention, we actually lack empirical validation regarding to which extent those claims are actually correct. For instance, counterclaims and a counter way of framing the debate is to focus on how the surplus generated from data is actually then allocated back to the different stakeholders, and whether in fact some stakeholders may receive back much of that value. And I'm thinking, for instance, about the data oligopolies, and some other stakeholders, perhaps online publishers, perhaps merchants, perhaps even consumers, are only getting back a small portion of the surplus.
If you try to distill it, it is about the changing dynamic of competition, the need for all of us to appreciate how big data and big analytics require us to take a very careful look at access to data, at barriers to entry, at the level of competition, and with all of that in mind, to appreciate how technology creates gatekeepers, how we have ways now that technology is used to affect the way that we search, influence our decision making. And with all of that in mind, there is a need for us to act. But as we act, we need to act in moderation. So we need to identify the adequate level of intervention. And as we do so, we need to find ways to align the interests of the key platforms and the gatekeepers with the consumer interest. Personally, I believe that the best way to do it is using an ex ante methods. So deal with it by aligning the landscape with our interests rather than by pursuing specific companies. But that, in a nutshell, would be the key message.
Great. Thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Well, it was a slightly unusual conference for me because I'm not a competition lawyer, but one of the common themes that comes out in discussions about digital enterprise and the digitization of society is what is the role of technological innovation in thinking about competition policy and public policy more generally, and in particular, what should we do about regulation and innovation? So I guess one of the things I was concerned with is to try and debunk some of the common myths or beliefs that are held, or at least peddled, in these discussions, and they are concerns about innovation being an unquestionable good. And whilst it may be good on many occasions, it does have its downsides. That regulation is therefore bad because it stifles innovation, and this is also problematic too. And I guess the core theme here is that our understanding of both innovation and of regulation and their relationship needs to be much deeper, contextual and more sophisticated than these typical assumptions bear out in much of the public policy dialogue. But one of the core things for me in my own work is to try and draw out the importance of recognising that in making decisions about whether, when and how to regulate private sector innovation, we're making some tough normative choices about what our values are as a society. What do we value? What do we value more than other things? How to make those trade-offs, and that we can't escape making those hard decisions when we confront these kinds of questions. And yet, because they're so difficult, the temptation is not to confront them at all. But I think that because the future really is in our hands, we have to confront them, and that's what I hope the key message is coming from my talk today.
What is your main message to the conference?
Actually, I think I have two of them. One of them is really that for today's AI, the main bottleneck is access to data. And the second one is that most of the data sets that are being collected and discussed today contain personal information. There are people behind those data sets, and this really needs to be considered.